that many people say the policy has been unclear, and they say it's particularly unclear on Scotland, with the First Minister of Scotland due to make a speech in a couple of hours' time, with some speculating she may even call there and then for a new referendum on independence. I'm not clear. Is Labour policy in favour of this referendum or against it?
No, we're not in favour of a referendum.
So why did you say it was absolutely fine in Glasgow? It should be held.
No, there was a bit of mischievous misreporting going on there. I did an interview during an economic development conference in Scotland hosted by the Labour Party, and we were looking at economic development in Scotland. But one thing is very, very clear. An economic strategy for Scotland based on oil prices doesn't work.
No,
therefore,
what's the misreporting? Sorry, I have accurately quoted you.
No, all right,
it is absolutely fine. It should be held, you said.
I was asked if in Westminster we would block the holding of a referendum. I said no. If the Scottish Parliament decided they wanted to have a referendum, then it would be wrong for Westminster to block it. But just to be absolutely clear, I do not think there should be another referendum. I think that independence would be economically catastrophic for many people in Scotland. It would lead to a sort of turbocharged austerity with the levels of income the government has in Scotland because of the very low oil prices and the high dependency on oil tax income.
It's not just journalists making a fuss. Scottish Labour's Justice spokesperson, Jackie Bailey, said that Corbyn's comments are an insult to the dedicated work of Scottish Labour MSPs, councillors and thousands of voters.
Jackie was unable to attend our economic conference on Saturday, and Alex Rowley and others came in her place and made a splendid contribution to that conference. When she made those comments, I suspect she had not heard what I'd actually said and the statement I put out afterwards.
No ambiguity then?
There is no ambiguity whatsoever, and those that are seeking mischief better go and seek it elsewhere.
BBC News at 4:00. Less than 3 years after the people of Scotland rejected independence in a referendum, the Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has announced she's seeking the power to hold a second vote. In a speech in Edinburgh, she accused Theresa May of refusing to move an inch in her determination to pursue a hard Brexit. In response, the Prime Minister said Ms Sturgeon was suffering from tunnel vision.
The evidence is that the Scottish people, majority of the Scottish people, do not want a second independence referendum. So instead of playing politics with the future of our country, the Scottish Government should focus on delivering good government and public services for the people of Scotland. Politics is not a game.
MPs have just begun debating changes to the government's Brexit bill. They're expected to reject amendments introduced by the House of Lords, which would guarantee the rights of EU...
Again, it's sort of moving beyond the realms of this committee, but my own view is whatever happens post-Brexit, the relationship between Scotland and England has been fractured further than it already was, and that there's an argument now, if not for independence, at the very least maximum devolution of powers, and we need even beyond the Devo Max we got post the independence referendum, we need a further movement of powers to Scotland as the only way of actually keeping the relationship workable. I know many people don't want to keep it workable, but if you want to keep it workable, I think maximum devolution is now the only option. Scotland clearly has indicated that it has a different set of preferences from the bulk of of England, not even the rest of the UK, but England, and therefore, yet again, I think we need to be looking at another constitutional settlement, and among that, I think labour and employment laws is a key element.
Do you think you can take your colleagues in the Labour Party with you on that?
No, I've been desperately trying to walk on eggshells, not be party political here, but actually I think you might be surprised that there is a growing movement inside the Labour Party as well that recognises that there is a need for a new relationship, but not everybody agrees with that, of course.
In the red shirt there, in the third row from the back.
I've heard a lot from the panel about England and Scotland. The United Kingdom includes 2 other countries.
Yes.
Where's their voice tonight?
Yeah.
And what's your view about that?
I think, as other people say, we're stronger together.
Yeah.
And Scotland, I'd like, as an Englishman, to have a vote as to whether or not I want Scotland to be part of the United Kingdom.
All right. And yes, the woman at the very back. The woman at the very back, her hand high in the air, yes.
I think that we have a lesson to learn from intersectionalism, and that is that when we're talking about racism, white people should be quiet. When we're talking about sexism, men should be quiet. And when we're talking about Scottish independence, English people should be quiet.
Okay. Well,
if it's necessary, given that the EU is not going to let us in, Spain, because of Catalonia, is not going to agree. Whether we try from the back of the queue or the fast-track system that operates in the Lisbon Treaty. Because if Spain lets Scotland in, Catalonia's away and everybody knows it. And, you know, Belgium as well has a problem with the Flemish and the Walloons. The EU officially has said you're not getting in. So that's one. Okay, what do we do in that circumstance?
What is the difference in the definition between an expat and a foreigner?
Well, first of all, expats are British. A foreigner is probably someone living from another country living in Britain. They become foreigners. The British are never foreigners wherever they go.
But if the President of the United States, in this case it might be a good thing given who is President, had to go to the Prime Minister of Canada for permission every time he wanted to do something, and also get the President of Mexico to sign off as well. That's called and he couldn't do his own thing. Yeah, but if he had to get it permission to do laws, then we just basically felt we should be able to govern ourselves. You know, we're big boys and girls.
The oil exploration firm Hurricane has made what's been described as the largest undeveloped discovery of oil in UK waters. It says 1 billion barrels of oil is contained within the Lancaster area, 60 miles west of Shetland. The company hopes to begin production in 2019.
I also refer the First Minister to that leading authority in all things European, Joan McAlpine, who said in January, and I won't do the accent, "There is no way a trade agreement is going to be put in place within 2 years. That is completely unrealistic." Now, of course, I wouldn't be as pessimistic as Miss McAlpine.
Conference, I'm very fond of old Scots words and phrases, as you know, but there's one old Scots term that doesn't make me swell with pride because it's forever associated with the poll tax, and that's the word pinding. A pinding was carried out by sheriff officers in advance of a warrant sale when a poor family of debtors would see their house invaded and their few precious possessions, an old telly or a worn three-piece suite, would be valued for sale. We often hear the anti-independence parties saying that the Constitution doesn't affect the lives of real people. It's incredible that they're still saying that 25 years after the poll tax, which had a very, very real effect on the most vulnerable people in our society, just like the bedroom tax is having today.
It is absolute nonsense. It is the worst type of scaremongering, and the only British politicians that are siding with terrorists, as you put it, are your leader and your shadow chancellor, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, are the only British politicians that side with terrorists in this country.
Incredibly cheap. And not a single member of your party has been out on the airwaves in the last 24 hours denying that the Prime Minister is threatening to withdraw cooperation.
What they have said at every point is that we need to ensure that we get cooperation because we will all be stronger.
Just to clarify,
that is the point.
In what respect are you saying Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell side with terrorists?
Because they wanted the IRA to win.
Oh, I see.
They walked past the people, they wore the British Army uniforms, and they walked up to the boys with the balaclavas and the bullets and the guns.
I think you should do well to defend your own party at the moment.
Ruth Davidson, do you just want to comment on this business that the Prime Minister could now, immediately, today, say that EU nationals can stay here?
Well, I think if it were up to me, you know, I would have liked to have seen it done, but I'm not the Prime Minister of the country, and I don't also have responsibility for the hundreds of thousands of Brits that live abroad. And she's got to balance the responsibilities she has for people currently living in Britain, as well as people who are British citizens.
But you would like to have seen her do that?
Like I say, if it were down to me, but then I'm not carrying the responsibility that she has, and I don't have to, in my sense, I don't have to balance the same responsibilities that she does.
But she might find a lot more goodwill overseas if she was prepared to concede in Britain.
All right, let's go. What are these modifications?
You're the one that's making it.
She said.
But you can't give us any examples.
No,
you're talking about changing the way we make laws. You're talking about,
no, because
you're on a stop speech here. Let's stop it.
The Prime Minister initially said.
As we translate the body of European law into our domestic regulations, we will ensure that workers' rights are fully protected and maintained. Stop scaremongering.
It's not scaremongering here. It's not scaremongering.
All right, then you've heard what you're saying.
And every week I hear a new coming person in the Labour Party that's going to be the next leader, whether it's Rebecca Long-Bailey or whether it's Clive Lewis or whether it's Lisa Nandy. And Lisa, for God's sake, love, do something about it and get in there. And if it's not going to be you, back someone else, because this country needs a new Labour Party leader. Because it is pathetic.
That is the sort of ringing endorsement that I need.
I've just spoiled it. The issue, I think, actually, is to take quite a lot of these decisions out of the hands of politicians, so you don't have hysterical he said, she said, which this is beginning to turn into onto this bloody panel. That's why you have ideas like people like Nice.
One person who was sounding enthusiastic on Twitter about Scottish independence was Richard Murphy, the economist whose ideas a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's fiscal policy is based on. So I gave him a call and asked him what he thought about it. I started by asking him if he was definitely pro-independence.
If I was living in Scotland and if I had a vote, I suspect I would vote for independence. Would I do that on the basis of the economic data alone? Well, let's be clear. My argument is that the economic data isn't good enough to justify that opinion. So I would have to exercise my judgment on other bases. And I think that the way in which the UK is heading, the way in which politics in the UK is heading, the way in which we are leading Brexit, all indicate that Scotland, or any other part of the UK, candidly, needs another chance, another opportunity. And if I was given that chance or opportunity, I would take it.
Okay. And so what are your core reasons for that?
Well, let's look at Scotland as a country. And for whatever Theresa May likes to say about, we all have our heart in the same place. I'm sorry, that's just not true. Edinburgh and Glasgow and some of the other cities I've been to, Perth and Inverness and Aberdeen, always felt like another country. A bit like going to Dublin. In Dublin, you recognise a place that is like the UK in a way that Paris is not like the UK, but is again distinctly different. That's also true of the major Scottish cities.
So it sounds a little bit like you're making more of a kind of nationalist argument rather than necessarily a sovereignty argument, because obviously, yes, Scotland does have a range of powers already, but it sounds like you're not saying Scotland could necessarily do more of its own thing, and that's the key thing. It kind of very much sounds like an identity thing. Do you think that's kind of a fair charge?
You've got to look at the information in its context and in its quality and whether it actually is capable of sustaining the analysis that you're going to give to it. And if I couldn't see that there was a separate nation state which could stand on its own 2 feet called Scotland, which had an identity which justified its description as a nation state, having a technical discussion about whether Scotland could survive as a separate entity or not would be utterly irrelevant. I mean, I don't think anybody, for example, is going to argue that there is a north of England which could be called Northumbria, which is currently capable of being identified as a location which should be independent from England, because there isn't a separate nation state that you can see there. So this analysis of whether there is a nation in the first place is a fundamental prerequisite of doing the economic analysis that might follow. The two are not separate.
And you touched also on the currency issue. So, yeah, you think that Scotland should definitely adopt a new currency. Can you expand on that a little bit?
If a state is to be independent, it has to have its own currency. In my opinion, the two are fundamentally related to each other. Therefore, I'm saying quite clearly that I think the euro was a very obvious mistake for the EU, and I suspect that that's not a terribly controversial opinion these days. Could an independent Scotland base its affairs on the pound? I don't think so. They have no control over their interest rate, so they have no control over their monetary policy. They therefore haven't got one of the major tools that is necessary to regulate demand and supply activity inside their own economy. They can't therefore control their own domestic inflation as easily as they might. They have difficulty with regard to fiscal policy even because they don't control the money supply. All of these things mean that basically the state hasn't got the levers of power that it requires to exercise a true economic policy, embracing both monetary and fiscal policy, i.e. interest rates and taxes, and the necessary balance between surpluses and deficits on a government's own current account. In which case, the government is not in control. If Scotland wants to be in control of its destiny, it has to have its own currency as a consequence. There is no question of that.
And from, as I understand it, from 2020, new EU states will have no choice but to join the euro. So is kind of the clock ticking on Scotland having its own currency if it wants to rejoin the EU after leaving the UK?
I have to say I don't think that statement is true. I think all rules are open to negotiation. I think that there is a requirement, as I understand it, that new states agree to join the euro, but they don't actually have to join the euro, and I think I made the distinction very carefully. Agreeing to join the euro one day is not the same as actually saying we will sign up now. So, for example, I think Sweden has in fact agreed to join the euro. I don't think it has any intention of actually setting a date where it might, and I think that's the important point.
David Martin, you told us how you voted in the last two referendums. How would you vote if Nicola Sturgeon does hold a second Scottish independence referendum?
In truth, I have no idea at the moment. There are too many factors to weigh up.
So you open to the idea of voting for independence?
The very fact I can't give you a straight answer indicates that I've moved, because if you'd asked me that question 18 months ago, it would have been a definitive that I would vote to remain in the United Kingdom. Now I think Brexit has put up a whole lot of questions that are yet to be answered.
President, thank you. As a Scottish European, I've long wondered how I'd feel today. And the answer is I'm heartbroken. Not for myself, but for the people I serve, for future generations. And Scotland will not be silent within this process as our rights are taken away by an administration we do not support, by a vote that we clearly rejected, and a process that is demonstrably against our interests. I'm also, while being heartbroken, also angry. I'm angry at this process. I'm angry at the way the UK is representing itself, doing a bad thing badly. Well, colleagues, Mrs May, Nigel Farage does not speak for Scotland. Do not speak for me. Do not speak for 48% of the UK's population. The UK is not one bloc, much as Mrs May would like it to be. The UK is a complicated set of various interests, all of which are better reflected in this resolution than in anything the UK government has put forward to date. Scotland will not be silent in this process, and Scotland's top priority, in the words of our First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, is to keep our citizens safe. Scotland is your home. You are welcome here. I appreciate that nothing is agreed till everything's agreed, but please, colleagues, let's make our citizens feel safe. Our citizens from the UK and other countries, and from our nations in ours. Let's deal with that first. Let's deal with that fast. Let's deal with it now. Thank you.
Thank you.
The fact is, we are from today the most overtaxed part of the UK. We will see how that works out in the next few years.
No, not at all. I think the Scottish Government need to realise that those who voted no back then knew there was going to be an EU referendum and still went ahead and says no to an independent Scotland.
There's a protest in Glasgow tonight against a UK-wide change to tax credits that's become known as the rape clause. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has described the policy as disgusting, but the Scottish Conservative leader, Ruth Davidson, has challenged the Scottish Government to use its own welfare powers if it wants to do things differently. Here's our political correspondent, Glenn Campbell.
These protesters gathering in Glasgow are against the new policy restricting child tax credit claims to the first two children. And they're far from impressed by the exemption for women who conceive a third or subsequent child as a result of sexual violence.
In order to claim for a third child that has been conceived through rape, a woman has to fill this out, and then she has to get a third party to sign it to say, yes, she has been raped. And this is the extreme measures and lengths they're expecting women to go to. I think it shows a complete lack of understanding around rape, sexual assault and the impact it has on women.
The Department for Work and Pensions says that women who have children through rape are specifically exempted from the two-child policy so that they don't lose out on benefit. And they say that such cases will be handled with compassion. But in America last week, the First Minister said the policy mistreats rape survivors.
They have to prove that the child was conceived as a result of rape. It is a disgusting and disgraceful policy.
On social media, the First Minister said it was shameful the Scottish Conservative leader defended the policy. Labour's Kezia Dugdale said it was abhorrent that Ruth Davidson had chosen not to speak out against it.
They have the powers to change the system in Scotland, to end something that they say that they oppose, but they're choosing not to do it because they would rather attack the UK government than change the system in Scotland. And I think the First Minister continuing to do that and not putting forward proposals to change this opens her up to allegations of gross hypocrisy.
It's vile, it's cruel, and it stigmatises not just the women, but those children too.
The SNP say the so-called rape clause and two-child policy for tax credits should be scrapped across the UK. Glenn Campbell, reporting Scotland.
Now, the UK government has published an 8-page document exempting some women from the government's third child tax cut. The exemption has become known as the rape clause because women who have conceived a child after being raped can be exempted from the cut if they fill out a form. The document has attracted widespread criticism from rape charities here, all of whom have vowed not to sign it. Well, to discuss the ethics of such a document is lecturer in law at Glasgow Caledonian University, Andrew Tickell. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Have you ever seen anything like this?
No. It's an obscene form of bureaucracy that makes women sign a form declaring that their child has been conceived as a consequence of rape. It is a remarkable and appalling document of a kind which most people, when you show it to them for the first time, in my experience, respond with simple astonishment. They think it was a bleak joke. It's not a bleak joke, it's UK government policy.
Yeah, in fact, it's entitled Support for a Child Conceived Without Consent, including rape or while you're in a coercive or controlling relationship. I wonder how many women, who've been in those circumstances might be willing to go forward and ask for that form. I mean, what is the ethical argument against it here?
Where to begin in terms of that? Well, firstly, it's simply a question of privacy. It's difficult to conceive of anything more fundamental in terms of privacy than that you have been a victim of sexual violence, and you'll be disclosing this to a random bureaucrat operating on behalf of the government. That's an astonishing invasion of privacy, and that's not simply a question of ethics, it's also a question of law, as principles of privacy are written into our law. We find it in Article 8 of the European Convention. If privacy is going to be infringed, if your privacy is going to be invaded, then the government has to justify it, it has to pursue a legitimate aim, and secondly, it has to be proportionate. You might well ask yourself, is it proportionate in pursuing this policy to force women who've been victims of sexual violence to disclose this? And it's worth stressing that we know, the statistics all show from the criminal justice statistics of the government and elsewhere, that the reported numbers of rapes are considerably fewer than the number of rapes which happen. The number of rapes which are prosecuted in our criminal courts are a tiny proportion of the overall total, and our courts struggle often to reach decisions on this. The conviction rate of those small number of cases, the tip of the iceberg, which end up in courts, are even smaller than that.
Well, interesting, of course, that most of the rape charities, help charities, have just refused to have anything to do with this or to sign it as a third party for any woman wanting to challenge the benefits decisions. Is there a legal issue with, the anonymity of rape victims? I mean, is it something that either they or indeed charities could challenge in the courts?
Well, your point about anonymity is a tremendously good one. That in general, if you are a complainer in a criminal case in Scotland alleging sexual assault, your name cannot be disclosed in this context. So, from a legal point of view, there may be an argument. I'm not saying it'll be a winning argument, but UK ministers have to uphold those fundamental rights I was talking about. They have to uphold principles of privacy. And if they don't, you can take them to a judicial review in the Court of Session. And the ministers would have to prove that the measure was legitimate and that it was proportionate, that it struck a fair balance between the rights of privacy of individuals on one hand and the collective interests on the other. So there may well be an argument here. We've seen in the political arena, Alison Thewlis, the Glasgow MP, has been pressing very hard in the House of Commons on this to no avail. This new policy became law as a consequence of a statutory instrument that Parliament didn't directly vote on. When the political arena fails you, you take your chance with the law, and as is often the case, the law can be quite unpredictable. But I think they have at least the ghost of an argument here, and it's the last best hope of desperate people, and it's hard to think of an alternative route here when the government, in the UK government, seems so deaf to the alarm that this has caused for so many people.
Thanks very much for talking to us this morning. Andrew Tickell there, lecturer in law at Glasgow Caledonian University.
If you went to the country now, you get a majority of something like 114 or 130. And that seems a wonderful opportunity for you. Are you tempted in any way to call a snap election?
I think what's important, particularly having had the referendum vote, is that we have a period of stability. There's a challenge ahead in ensuring that we make a success of coming out of the European Union. I think it's important that we focus on that and the other reform agenda that I have for the country as we go forward. And we'll be continuing the manifesto on which the Conservative government was elected in 2015. So I don't think there's a need for an election. I think the next election would be in 2020.
Let me make this very clear, because again, it's very important. Under current law, the next election will be in 2020. No ifs, no buts, no snap elections, no changing the law. Under you, is that absolutely certain, that we're not going to see an election before 2020?
I'm not going to be calling a snap election. I've been very clear that I think we need that period of time, that stability, to be able to deal with the issues that the country is facing and have that election in 2020. I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
But Roger, why do we need to then go back to the negotiating table in this matter if there is such an imbalance in the powers that we have?
Well, there are extraordinary imbalances in the relationship, and I mean, a few weeks ago, for better or worse, I wrote a blog about GERS Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland statement, for which my Twitter timeline is still suffering. I can assure you that I have never met anywhere which is more interested in national income accounting than Scotland. You have turned it into a national obsession, it seems. I was a little surprised by the reaction. So I walk with a little trepidation, knowing full well that someone somewhere will have a lot to say about what follows. Look, the simple fact is that the amount that is known about Scottish taxation is very little indeed. Yeah, let's put it bluntly. Inside GERS, 25 of the 26 income figures are estimates. And as Graham Roy has said at the Fraser of Allender Institute, and he was responsible for preparing it for 7 years, they are prepared on the basis that Scotland is a mini part of the UK and the figures are simply an apportionment of the UK as a whole. So, in other words, Scotland is not an independent entity, and yet I'm sitting in what seems to me to be the Scottish Parliament, which clearly recognises that Scotland has some independence as an entity, and is being given devolved taxation powers, but is not being given the data to make decisions upon. That was the core argument that I presented. And however you look at GERS, and yes, I am quite sure that those who are tasked with preparing it do it with all good faith and with due diligence on the data they get from the ONS and elsewhere. But nobody would ever prepare the income statement for a region, a devolved country administration or whatever else on the basis of samples and statistics if you could actually collect the population data. You know, as in statistical terms, you'd always like to know the real figure, not the statistical estimate of what that might be. And if the GERS statement was so good as a basis for estimating Scottish taxation income, then the UK would use that system as a whole, but I assure you it doesn't. It actually uses the data on the amount of tax collected, which is obvious direction of travel. So if Scotland is going to get a fair deal on tax under whatever system exists, however it's framed, whatever the rules on detriment and so on, then Scotland needs the data to make decisions to see how these issues do impact upon it. And it's no good just having information on income tax, which is obviously an income tax from employment, which is obviously the one area where there now looks to be a reasonable chance of the quality of data improving, because as we're seeing, what's going on here is an arbitrage between one tax and another tax, taxes that will be subject to Scottish rates, taxes that we will not be, national insurance, corporation tax, and so on. And there, who knows, whether or not you have Scottish registered businesses or not does, of course, even potentially have impact upon the VAT collected in Scotland as well. And it could quite easily have that as well. Because if there isn't business in Scotland, there will be less VAT charged as such on a differentiated business framework in Scotland. And that does have an impact. So one of the things that you need to do if you're going to get this framework right is to actually say, for heaven's sake, can we please have the real information And I wouldn't make this request just for Scotland. I think Wales needs it, Northern Ireland needs it. I can see good reason why you should be cooperating with colleagues in other parliaments and assemblies for that reason. Indeed, I can't actually see why the new Mayor of Manchester won't want this if he's going to ask for taxing powers. It is going to be a he. I'm not being gender specific here. Why London may not want it and so on, because the data should be collected. But Scotland very definitely needs it because you have taxing powers, and at the moment you simply do not have the right information. I tell my students when I teach them about the quality of data that they're going to interpret to actually look at whether it's good information or not, and the phrase I use is CRAP. CRAP is a technical term. It stands for completely rubbish approximations, and that's what you get to assess your tax system at present.
Thank you.
Question 6, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the accuracy of the GERS figures.
First Minister.
GERS is a national statistics publication, which means that it has been independently assessed by the UK Statistics Authority to ensure that it meets the Code of Practice for Official Statistics. That code ensures that statistics are of high quality and of public value. GERS estimates the level of public revenue raised in Scotland and the level of public spending for residents of Scotland under the current constitutional arrangements. It is based on a range of estimates and it is not an indication of the finances of an independent Scotland, which of course would be dependent on a range of other factors, including the spending choices and priorities of the government of the day.
Liam Kerr.
I thank the First Minister for that reply, but she has to say that to those SNP supporters, including members of this chamber, who in recent months have mounted a concerted campaign to undermine and delegitimise GERS. So can she also put on record that GERS are official statistics produced by her government to the highest standards, and that those who denigrate the figures are, including in this chamber, as a matter of fact, simply wrong?
First Minister.
Well, can I recommend to the member that when he comes here and asks a question, he actually manages to listen to the answer. Let me repeat what I said in my first answer. He stood up there in his supplementary and asked me to put on record that they are national statistics. The first words in my original answer were GERS is a national statistics publication. A bit of listening instead of heckling might have gone down well. The point I'm making, simple point I'm making is this, is that GERS doesn't tell us anything much about the finances of an independent Scotland. And it's not just me that says that. The Fraser of Allender Institute says that GERS reflects current constitutional arrangements. And of course we have a leading anti-independence campaigner who himself said in radio recently, nobody suggests that the GERS figures show what a future independent Scotland would look like. So yes, they are official statistics. Official statistics are known for being high quality and of public value. They have a range of estimates underpinning them, as everybody is aware of, but crucially they reflect the position in Scotland, as the Fraser of Allender Institute says, under current constitutional arrangements, not under independence.
So Richard finished his piece there by saying they can't tell us what an independent Scotland's finances would look like. That is, of course, absolutely true.
Just to be clear then, if parents are listening and if their child is about to go to a new build school, there won't have been a system of self-certification there where only one person has signed this off. Well, that has now changed.
Well, in relation to new build schools, Gary, of course, the schools you're talking about, which have been affected by the survey that you've undertaken, they are new schools, but they were built over 10 years ago. And what the government is now doing is taking forward different construction methods around the new school building that is taking place within Scotland.
So when did that change?
Well, that changed with the change of government in 2007. And we brought in new mechanisms through the Scottish Futures Trust, which doesn't make the same mistakes that were made under PPP.
Well, that's a funding mechanism. We're talking here specifically. I'll come back to that in a second, but we're talking specifically about construction methods,
yes,
aren't we?
And that's precisely the point I'm making to you, Gary. These schools that you're talking about were built under a brick and block system. We now use a steel framing system, which is much more individually configured to individual schools. In the Edinburgh example, 17 schools were taken forward as a batch purchase by the City of Edinburgh Council. That no longer happens. We now do individual design based on the steel framing system to customise schools for the needs of individual localities and to give us much greater control over that construction process.
So just to be clear then, none of these...
So that's the material change in construction methodology that you were asking me about, which has taken place since 2007 and the establishment of the Scottish Futures Trust.
So none of these schools affected then were built under the Scottish Futures Trust?
None of them, no.
They have the powers to change the system in Scotland, to end something that they say that they oppose, but they're choosing not to do it because they would rather attack the UK government than change the system in Scotland. And I think the First Minister continuing to do that and not putting forward proposals to change this opened her up to allegations of gross hypocrisy.
Parting thought for George Osborne as he steps down, the man who you might say masterminded your decapitation.
Oh, do I have a parting thought for him? Well, good luck to him. I mean, good luck to him. I think, do you know what? I think it's quite telling that, however much I staunchly disagree with George Osborne over many years, he is a particular conservative. He has quite a metropolitan turn of mind. He believes in globalisation. He believes in a sort of slightly more cosmopolitan view of the world. If the Conservative Party can't retain people like that, and whatever you think, like or dislike George Osborne, he's a formidable figure in the Conservative Party. If the Conservative Party can't keep people like that, the danger is it becomes ever more narrow and sect-like as a party, not a broad church, and that won't serve the Conservative Party well in the long run.
Nick Clegg, thank you.
Thank you.
What do you think of Theresa May calling for a snap election?
It's a sign of her strength because she's 20% ahead in the polls, but it's also a sign that in 6 months' time, the economy is going to be down and these European negotiations are going to be nasty, brutish and long.
But the Jeremy Corbyn, is that the Labour guy in Britain?
It's painful for you to say that, but yes, that is the leader of the party at the moment. And
I mean, man, I thought we had some care eaters here. This guy is too far, right? I mean, we're all liberals here, but let's...
What?
Angus Robertson! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has said that she wants unity, and she has said that she wants an end to division, and she intends to do that by crushing opposition with political opponents described as saboteurs, something I invited her earlier to take a distance from, but she was not prepared to. This is not a vision or an understanding of mainstream democracy that I share with the Prime Minister. For months we have heard from her that now is not the time for the public to vote, that no one wants it, that it's important to get on with the day job. We've been told that the Prime Minister needs to concentrate all of her time on Brexit negotiations and that nothing should get in the way. But now, as we have all learned in the last 24 hours, all of that was empty rhetoric. And there are two key reasons why there is going to be a general election. And the first is totally politically expedient. It is about the woeful, unelectable state of the Labour Party. And that is a reason of political expediency to hold an election. It is about not wanting to repeat the political error that Gordon Brown made. And the Prime Minister wants to receive her own electoral mandate and crush political opposition in England. The second reason for holding an early general election is that it's finally dawned on the UK government that the Brexit negotiations are going to be very, very difficult. And the realities of the hard Brexit that the Prime Minister is pursuing has not yet fully dawned on the public. And as one commentator wrote, just in a moment if I can make some progress on this point, as one commentator wrote today, the EU is not going to roll over and give the UK free and frictionless access to the internal market. The Prime Minister is cutting and running, getting a vote in before the reality of hard Brexit hits home. And can I tell the Prime Minister that while she thinks that she can get her way with all of this against the Labour Party in England, she will not get away with this in Scotland.
I thank him for giving way. On the subject of hard Brexit, does he agree with me that it is incumbent on those who are advocating it to set out very clearly what their assessment of the impact on jobs is going to be of us coming out of the single market and the customs union?
of course, that would be an opportunity in a normal general election campaign where party leaders actually debate the issues and their record for them to add. But there's been an interesting development since the debate. So I've noticed colleagues looking at their mobile phones, because ITV's confirmed that there is going to be a leaders' debate. And I'm just interested, I'm looking around, there are a number of other party leaders in the chamber. I'm looking at the leader of the opposition. Is the leader of the opposition intending to take part in the debate? I suspect he probably will take part in a television debate. No doubt the leader of the Liberal Democrats and the leader of the Green Party and colleagues. I'll make my point here. It is unsustainable in the 21st century, in the multimedia age, to go to the country and not to debate the leaders of other political parties. The notion that the UK Prime Minister might be empty-chaired because she's not prepared to stand up for her arguments is just not sustainable. Perhaps she would wish that the honourable gentleman who's seeking to intervene might take her place instead.
As I said in the House, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, I hope that the Prime Minister does go head-to-head with the leaders of other parties. It's quite simple, Mr. Speaker. She would floor them all.
No, she wouldn't. I don't think she would manage that with Nicola Sturgeon. But I am surprised, and I welcome what the honourable gentleman had to say in encouragement to the Prime Minister, because I think the public deserves a debate, more than one debate, during the election campaign, and I think the Prime Minister should have some more confidence in herself. I think she should be prepared to address the country and to debate the ideas that all the different political parties across the UK have. But we have already learned, of course, in Scotland, that the Prime Minister is prepared to ignore the mandate and wishes of the Scottish electorate, of the Scottish Parliament, and of the Scottish Government. So why would anyone in Scotland, I need to make some progress, so why would anyone in Scotland vote for such a dismissive and disrespectful party and Prime Minister? I need to make some progress. Time is limited. I will try and take some interventions later. The Prime Minister promised that she would have a unified approach with all the devolved governments, an agreement, before triggering Brexit. She didn't. She broke her word. And as we have learnt in recent weeks in connection with the appalling rape clause, the one thing that the Scottish Tories don't like talking about is Tory policy. But this election will highlight the dangers to Scotland of unfettered Tory Westminster government. And we live in one of the most unequal countries in the developed world, but the Tories want to make it even more unfair. Experts say that their policies will cause the largest increase in inequality since the days of Margaret Thatcher.
Would you give way?
They want to, happy to give way to the leader of the Green.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Does he agree with me that if this election is, as the Prime Minister says, about a more secure future for this country, if it is an election of such national significance, we should have an urgent change in the law to give Britain's 1.5 million 16 and 17-year-olds a say in what will be very much their future on the 8th of June?
As somebody who gave his maiden speech about enfranchising 16 and 17-year-olds, I totally agree with the Honourable Lady. It is again unsustainable that young people have been given the vote for some elections and referenda, but should be denied it in others. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Most grateful to the right honourable gentleman giving way. He will be aware that the Supreme Court made it abundantly clear, and all the judges decided on a unanimous basis, that issues concerning Brexit negotiations should be determined by this House, which represents the whole of the United Kingdom, and that this was not an issue to be decided by any of the devolved institutions. Which bit of that does the right honourable gentleman have a problem in understanding?
The thing I have a difficulty understanding is the commitment that the Prime Minister gave. She gave it when she came to Edinburgh. It was on the front page of the House Journal of the Conservative Party, the Daily Telegraph. It was there in terms that she wanted to seek a UK-wide approach, an agreement with the government. So the honourable gentleman might wish to rewrite history, but the Prime Minister gave a commitment to reach an agreement. She did not reach an agreement. Mr. Speaker, the Fixed Term Parliament Act was supposed to stop political parties abusing their position and putting party before country. Today, the Tories are going to do just that, and sadly, the Labour Party is going to vote with the Tories and make life easy for them. We on these benches will not vote with the Tories, but given the realities that the Labour Party is going to be voting with the Tories, there will be a general election, and boy, we look forward to that. Because in Scotland,
we're not dancing to your tune. Mr. Morris, normally you've got a very emollient manner. You're a very restrained individual, bordering upon the cerebral. But you become rather overexcited. Calm yourself. Take some sort of soothing medicament. It will have a beneficial impact upon you. Mr. Angus Robertson.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. In Scotland, the general election will be a two-horse race. It'll be a straight fight between the SNP and the Tories. And do I think that mainstream Scots, regardless of whether they voted Remain or Leave, will vote for a hard Tory Brexit? No, I don't. Will most mainstream Scots vote for more austerity and cuts to public services? No, I don't. And will most Scots vote for a party that is actively undermining the mandate already given by the voters in a Scottish general election for people in Scotland to determine their own future? No, I do not. We on these benches will work hard for every vote in every seat in Scotland. And Mr. Speaker, we look forward to defeating the Tories in this general election.
Has asked for a copy of it. Is that right?
It was referenced in the Audit Scotland.
No, but
the existence of the letter was referenced in the Audit Scotland.
Nobody
report.
asked for a copy of it.
No.
That tells you a lot about the board of the SPA. Convener, I think it's quite obvious this is a shambles.
Thank you very much, Mr. Neil. Can we move on?
Firstly, let's be clear about this. The Scottish Government cannot abolish the two-child cap or the rape clause. We do not have the legal power to do so. And given the complexity of tax credits and universal credit, trying to mitigate the impact of these cuts would be significantly more complex than simply compensating people for the bedroom tax. But that's not the only issue. The real issue here is the financial impact of mitigation on other services. You see, and this is a key point, when the UK Government makes these cuts, they don't pass Scotland's share of the savings on to the Scottish Government. If they did, we could make our own choices, whether to reverse the cut or follow the UK Government in spending the money elsewhere. But the UK Government keeps the money from those savings. So any decision by this Government to mitigate one of these cuts involves taking money that is already allocated to schools, to hospitals and to other services. And of course, notwithstanding that, we have mitigated where we can. We shouldn't have to, but we have. Since 2013, this Government has spent £350 million mitigating the bedroom tax. And where we control benefits, we do make our own choices. So we won't, for example, apply the two-child cap in our council tax reduction scheme. But we simply cannot accept a situation where the Tories can implement whatever heartless cut they want to, and the only answer is for the Scottish Government to take money from elsewhere to plug the gap. Because where does that end? If we accept that argument, there would be nothing to stop the Tories deciding to no longer pay any benefits for people in Scotland, pocket the savings and look to the Scottish Government to step in. It is a ridiculous and unsustainable argument.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Scotland has consistently attracted fewer migrants to come and live here relative to other parts of the United Kingdom in relation to our population share. Why does the First Minister think, after 10 years of SNP government, Scotland is a relatively unattractive place for immigrants to come?
First Minister.
What a disgraceful thing. What an utterly disgraceful thing for a member of this Parliament to stand up in this chamber and describe his own country as an unattractive place to live. Murdo Fraser, hang your head in shame. As I've said before in this chamber, I remember the days, and they are becoming dark, distant days, when Murdo Fraser used to be a serious politician. Now it seems he just aspires to be a figure of fun in this chamber. But the serious point here is this. We do have to encourage people to come here. One of the reasons why more migrants will settle in London and the South East is partly down to geography, which I think anybody applying a bit of common sense would show. But we've just had figures showing the contribution that inward migration is making to our population growth. So the real question is not the one that Murdo Fraser posed. The real question is this: are we going to make sure over these next few years that we continue to have the ability to attract people to come to live in Scotland, or are we going to allow narrow-minded Tories to put barriers in the way of that? That is the big question and the big decision for Scotland in the next few years.
Now, during the last general election, the Conservatives promised to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. Year after year, the party has failed to reach the target, which was first set in 2010. Well, now Theresa May plans to include the commitment in her manifesto for this election, and she says leaving the EU makes it easier to achieve. So how will the target impact on Scotland? Let's speak to Joanna Cherry, the SNP's Justice and Home Affairs spokesperson, and the Scottish Conservative MSP Adam Tompkins. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Gary.
Adam Tompkins, when will we reach the tens of thousands?
Well, I think we have a much greater chance of reaching that target sooner rather than later because we're leaving the European Union. Leaving the European Union means that we can bring back control to the United Kingdom of our borders and of our immigration policy, both with regard to EU migrants and with regard to immigration from the rest of the world.
Well, we've had a control over immigration for the rest of the world all this time that we've been a member of the EU. We haven't managed to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands. In fact, it's been about 300,000 roughly.
Well, we have brought it down by, I think, about 50,000 over the course of the last 3 years. The net immigration target, net migration now is, I think, 270,000, down from 330,000. So it is coming down.
But so 50,000 a year, then that's what, 4 or 5 years down the line after Brexit?
Yeah, I mean, this is a challenge. I don't think anybody pretends that this is easy, but I think it's important that we have controlled and sustainable immigration so that we don't have unsustainable pressure put on our public services and so that we don't have an uncontrolled immigration like Joanna Cherry wants and like Jeremy Corbyn wants that will simply drive wages down.
Well, Joanna Cherry, Nicola Sturgeon, and we heard a clip of her earlier saying this, it's important for politicians to address concerns about immigration. That's what this measure does, doesn't it?
Well, this measure is neither practicable or workable. And the reason we know that is Theresa May, as Home Secretary, has missed the targets set in the last two manifestos. And even her cabinet colleagues think it's unworkable. When Amber Rudd became Home Secretary last summer, she tried to depart from these targets but was firmly slapped into place by Theresa May. These targets are driven by ideology and by the Tories' attempt to capture the UKIP vote rather than being evidence-based. And we heard Professor David Bell in your programme earlier explaining how migrants are on average more likely to be in work, more likely to be better educated and more likely to be young and therefore more likely to grow the economy.
Well, if Nicola Sturgeon's right, though, and politicians need to address concerns about immigration, how are you going to address those concerns?
Well, we would like to see a devolution of immigration powers to the Scottish Parliament so we can have a tailored policy that fits the needs of communities in Scotland and the Scottish economy.
With a cap?
We're not alone in wanting this. The Mayor of London has also called for greater flexibility, and business in Scotland wants this. The Executive Director of the Institute of Directors has told us that so far as business is concerned, Scotland needs a different immigration policy from the rest of the UK. The Scottish Chambers of Commerce came out in February of this year and said business based in Scotland want a separate immigration policy for Scotland. Heriot Watt University in my constituency of Edinburgh South West has made redundancies blaming Brexit and the government's policies on immigration. So what the Scottish Government wants is an immigration policy for Scotland that's based on the evidence and that is designed to fit the needs of our communities and to grow the Scottish economy.
Okay, Adam, let me bring in Adam Tompkins. Let me bring in Adam Tompkins here. And to that end, Adam Tompkins, Joanna Cherry is right, isn't she? That actually this is not evidence-based. This is an arbitrary target. Why the tens of thousands?
Well, I mean, Joanna Cherry is talking about what Scottish business needs. What Scottish business needs is a skills economy here in Scotland.
Why don't you reintroduce a post-study work visa then, Adam? That's what Scottish business wants.
Joanna, you've had more than enough say.
Thank you for that.
The Well, I didn't interrupt you while you were talking earlier, so perhaps you could show me the same courtesy, or perhaps that's too much to ask. What Scottish business wants is a skills economy. Skills development is entirely devolved to the Scottish Parliament and has been since the beginning of devolution. Skills Development Scotland, an entirely devolved body, spends £80 million of taxpayers' money every year.
And if certain businesses feel they need more skilled workers and they can find those skilled workers abroad, but the UK government set an arbitrary cap, what does that mean for Scottish businesses?
I think the issue with regard to migrant labour in Scotland at the moment is, the question is, why do only 4% of migrants coming to the United Kingdom choose to come to Scotland? The reason why it's so low, Gary, is surely because migrants don't want to live in the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom, and Scotland is now the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom because of the SNP's catastrophic.
Sure, but that does not answer the question I asked you. The question is, well, hang on a second, but the question is, if a business, and you're saying that businesses will need skilled migrants, if they feel they need more of them, but the UK government has set an arbitrary cap, where do those businesses go?
Well, leaving the European Union gives us the power to take back control of our immigration policy so that we can tailor an immigration policy that is suitable for every part of the economy.
But you're setting a cap. You're setting a cap at tens of thousands. So once we reach that point, if a business needs more, where do they go?
We're setting a cap which is relevant to the economic needs of the British economy, north of the border, south of the border, and in every part of the United Kingdom.
Where's the study that says tens of thousands meets the economic needs?
Where's the study that says that uncontrolled free movement of workers is good for the British economy, is good for public services, or is good for keeping wages high? I mean, look, we need to have controlled immigration. Leaving the European Union gives us the opportunity for the first time in 45 years to have control in the United Kingdom of our own migration policy. And that migration policy needs to be tailored to the various different economic needs across the United Kingdom, included in Scotland, including in Scotland. And that will happen. And it will happen because we're leaving the European Union.
Joanna Cherry, to that end, how many migrants does Scotland need?
Well, Adam's very reluctant to talk about the post-study work visa, which is understandable because all political parties in Scotland have recommended that the British government allow the Scottish government to reintroduce the post-study work visa.
To then set the immigration level at what?
Even Adam's Scottish Conservatives have supported that, but their Westminster bosses won't allow it. David Mundell is unable to persuade his cabinet colleagues to introduce the post-study work visa, which is supported by business across Scotland.
Can I bring you back to the question, how many migrants does Scotland need?
On the question of figures, Scotland needs to look to the skills that she needs to attract, and that's what the post-study work visa is designed to do. Now, I'm not going to put figures on it here this morning.
So it's potentially unlimited?
No, it is not potentially unlimited. The post-study work visa was not an unlimited scheme. There are many countries in the world that operate differentiated immigration policies. I've recently returned from a study trip to Canada, which operates a very successful differentiated immigration policy, whereby individual provinces in Canada can flex the requirements of the national immigration system to their need.
But if you're adamant, but I want to ask you a question here. I'll let you come back to that in a second, but I just want to pursue this for a second, because if you're adamant that Scotland needs a different system to the rest of the UK, you must have some idea as to how many people Scotland needs.
Well, those sort of decisions would be taken in discussion with the Scottish society and the Scottish economy when the power is devolved. What we will not do is we will not set arbitrary targets which are not evidence-based.
So where does that address people's concerns about immigration, as Nicola Sturgeon mentioned?
People not coming to Scotland because Scotland's the highest taxed part of the UK. Adam's wrong about that. Scotland is not the highest taxed part of the UK. If you take into account the council tax in Scotland and also universal benefits such as free prescription charges in Scotland, Scotland is actually a very attractive place to come and work.
So why are only 4% of migrants to Scotland?
The reason people are not coming to Scotland to work is because the Scottish government is being prevented from having the flexibility of immigration
powers. Why are only 4% of migrants coming to Scotland then, Joanna?
Adam, if you would stop interrupting me, let me finish the sentence. I sat on the Exiting the EU Select Committee in the last Parliament at Westminster, and we heard evidence from a variety of experts and indeed from business, agricultural, the food sector in Scotland, and they all said that they require EU nationals and indeed people from beyond the EU to come and work in Scotland to support their businesses. That cross-party committee unanimously recommended that the British government should look very seriously at the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government and the London Mayor's request for more flexibility in immigration policy. That's what we're looking for, a flexible immigration policy that is evidence-based rather than ideologically driven.
Do you accept that Scotland can have a different policy to the rest of the UK?
It is only by leaving the European Union that we have the opportunity of developing an immigration policy that is fit for purpose, not just for
Are you talking
the
about
economy,
Scotland or UK-wide?
Not just for the economy in the UK as a whole, but for the economies in various different parts of the UK.
So a separate system for Scotland is feasible? Is it desirable?
It is only by leaving the European Union that it's even possible. I mean, what Joanna wants to do is to take...
Well, let's accept that it's possible. Is it desirable?
It's sensible to have an immigration policy which is tailored to the economic needs of the United Kingdom, and the economic needs of the United Kingdom might vary sector to sector, and they might vary region to region. But look, it's not the case that the economic needs of Scotland are different from the economic needs of England. It is the case that there are different economic needs within the Scottish economy. The economy of Glasgow is very different from the economy of the Highlands, is very different from the economy of the borders. And it is only by leaving the European Union that you are able to design an immigration policy which is fit for the economic purposes of all of the regions of the United Kingdom.
A final point to both of you on something else that the Conservatives are promising today, and this is an energy cap. Adam Tompkins, why was it a Marxist idea 2 years ago, but a good idea now?
Well, I mean, the energy cap that is being proposed by the Conservatives is very different in design and structure.
It's pretty much identical.
No, it's not. It's very different.
It's a freeze and a cap by Ofgem.
It's very different in design and delivery from the idea that was proposed by, I think, Ed Miliband a few years ago, an idea which was roundly rejected.
2 years ago, David Cameron said it was a Marxist idea.
Well, what Ed Miliband was proposing 2 years ago is very different from what the Scottish Conservatives, or the UK Conservatives, are proposing now. Where there is evidence of market failure, it is appropriate for a government to try and step in and correct that market, and that's what we're looking at. And Theresa May is absolutely right to say that people are concerned about their energy bills, and that it is the responsibility of government to take cognizance of that and to respond accordingly.
Joanna Cherry, can your party support this policy that would reduce bills for millions of people, according to Theresa May?
We'll be bringing forward our manifesto in the very near future, and I'm not going to anticipate what's in that before
Does that sound like a good idea?
What I'll say about this idea is it's typical of the Tories flip-flopping. Last year, Ruth Davidson and Adam Tompkins told us it was absolutely vital for Scotland to stay in the European Union for the sake of the Scottish and indeed the British economy, and they've done a massive U-turn on this. This is just another example of a Tory U-turn.
Let me thank you both very much for your time this morning. Joanna Cherry of the SNP, Adam Tompkins of the Scottish Conservatives.
David's in Coatbridge. Hi, David.
Hi, Kate.
Morning. How do you feel about the kind of visible presence of armed personnel, whether they be police officers or army personnel?
Again, I need to agree with the woman there. I mean, you look at what happened when we put armed forces in the streets of Northern Ireland. Didn't work, only turned people against each other. I think it might have the same effect on young Muslims in this country. It might be very, very threatening towards them. But the only way I feel we can protect ourselves here is with follow President Trump's lead and ban certain nationalities from this country. This young 22-year-old boy, I believe, listening to your programme today, or show today, is just back from Libya a couple of days. Well, why was he allowed to travel to Libya? And more importantly, why was he allowed to return and not be surveyed? Surely the money should be put to these resources and not just put police in the streets. And,
born in Manchester, David.
I know they've born in Manchester, but he travelled to Libya recently and returned from Libya recently.
Well,
so why are we allowing these people to come to our country? You seen the show last week from BBC One about the Pakistani men buying young Roma girls?
But hang on, David. When we're saying these people
from this country,
when you say yeah, but David, I'm interested. What is these people?
Pakistanis.
David,
Slovakians.
Seriously?
Yes, we need to ban
entire nationalities you're putting into the same bracket?
Yes. Because how many people you want to let in for one bad one? Is it 1 million people for one bad one? Is it 1,000 people for one bad one? If we're allowing anybody in, we need to all be willing to adhere to the rules of this country and the laws of this country. The fact of the matter is we're not. It's a shambles. A complete and utter shambles. We're allowing
David, I'll be honest. I am shocked by your statement. I am utterly shocked by your statement.
This is the problem, okay? The media, like yourself, are fooling the people. And
David, I am not the media. I am a person, and I am shocked by your statement. I mean, I have listened this morning, as you will, to the Pakistani community in Manchester, the vast majority of whom, if not all of them, are utterly appalled and devastated by these events, like you and me.
Well, what about that programme that was on recently of 3 girls? What did you think of that, Kate? And what about what's happening in Govan Hill right now?
David, last week Ian Brady died. He was a white man. I'm not pointing my finger at you, am I?
Well, what has that got to do with me?
Well, listen, let's move on.
The yellow one and the blue one, the pencil.
In North Berwick, meanwhile, Labour were enjoying temporarily disarming their opponents.
Are you absolutely sure we will get a deal?
I'm pretty sure. I'm not 100% sure. You can have, it's a negotiation.
Because you said, again, you said right at the beginning of this, we are guaranteed to get a deal. You can be sure we'll get a deal.
No, you can be sure there'll be a deal. It's the deal I want, which is the free trade agreement, the customs agreement, and so on. I'm pretty sure, but I'm not certain.
So can Catholics join the Orange Order?
No, the Orange Order is exclusively for the members of the Reformed faith.
Several members of the Orange Order have said, look, one way to reform would be to allow people who are in the Orange Order to attend a mass without being punished. Is that something that's happening or not?
At the present moment in time, there is no paperwork on the table for to have a look at that rule. There is a rule such as that.
So there is a rule that says if you attend a mass, you'll be punished?
These rules are continually looked at. That's not my rule. It's a rule of the institution that's been there for quite a number of years. As I say, people are entitled to go about their daily business as they wish. At the moment, there's no intention to look at the rule.
So as it stands, and again, to help me understand this, because I don't, if you have a friend who is a Catholic who dies, you couldn't go to the funeral because there'd be a mass?
To go to church?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to go to the church, no, because we are totally against the teachings and the faith of the Roman Church. To show your support to a Roman Mass would be wrong in the eyes of the institution and the members within it, obviously. The majority of the members of this institution chose to have that as a rule. I didn't choose the rule. I just adhere to the rules.
But you've got friends who are Catholics. This is what's hard to understand, isn't it? You've got friends, you said, who are Catholics. You said there are Catholics coming up to watch the march. Yeah. But if any of your friends were to die, you couldn't... It's against the rules to even go and celebrate that or commiserate with their family members in their chapel, in their church.
No, that would be the choice. Every individual has a choice. In life, everybody has a choice. There's challenges in life at all times. I would choose not to go to a Roman Catholic church in any manner, so it wouldn't matter to me whatsoever. I believe that the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church are wrong. It doesn't mean to say that I don't understand that the Roman Catholic Church are entitled to their beliefs, which I fully support. I just don't agree with the belief.
And yet you both believe in the same loving God.
Yeah. We're both of the Christian family with different outlook to the scriptures.
Would you go into a Catholic church?
Well, I'm a member of the Orange Institution in Scotland. We have rules. The membership make the rules, and until them rules are changed, we've got to abide by the rules.
So you're not allowed to go into a Catholic church?
I'm not allowed to take Mass in a Catholic church, and I don't think that'd be... to your listeners, I can't take Mass in a Catholic church, no. But why would I want to go to a Catholic church and take Mass? I'm a Protestant. I believe in the Protestant religion. I'm part of the Reformed faith. So why would I go to a Catholic church to take Mass?
But would you be comfortable to be inside a Catholic church?
There's no reason for me to go inside a Catholic church.
Well, you might be invited to a wedding.
Yeah, I can be invited to a wedding. Yeah, fine, but it'd be my decision whether I go or not.
And would you go?
Probably not, no. It's my religion, that's how I feel about it. We have rules in this organisation, and until the membership take a decision to change the rules, I've got to abide by the rules. You join the organisation, and you know what the rules are before you join, so that's the rules.
So if you had a friend who was a Catholic who died, you wouldn't go to their funeral?
I could go to the graveside, but I would not go into the Mass, no. I'm quite clear. I'm not trying to hide around this. It was discussed last week on the BBC again. That question was raised by one of your colleagues to the Grand Master last week, and it was the same answer he got then.
OK, fine. I asked you the question, you answered it. Thank you.
The health services of the other UK nations could learn lessons from the Scottish NHS, according to a new report. The Nuffield Trust says Scotland's NHS engages frontline staff, doesn't chop and change policies every couple of years, and has worked hard to get its healthcare services to cooperate. But the report warns of an intense financial squeeze ahead, with no medium-term plan to deal with it.
And Ruth Davidson is always the one who's mentioned, isn't she? When you talk to sort of the Liberal Conservative MPs about, you know, who's your sort of champion, they get a wistful air and they say,
really do,
Ruth Davidson, but she's in the wrong place. Could that ever happen? Could she ever be parachuted down to Westminster, or would that just not work? Is it just a different market?
What's very interesting is, I mean, I understand that it's for sure, but I'm fairly confident that when the snap election was called, Ruth Davidson looked at, considered taking a Westminster seat. I mean, she had to quite quickly try and get selected if she wanted to do it, and thought, no, it's too soon and now's not the time. I bet she maybe regrets that decision now. I mean, because if she was in Parliament right now, there would be a very strong movement to get her right into the cabinet, possibly to the very top quite quickly, because she does seem to have a capability in politics, which is separate from her sort of slightly liberal Remainy sort of policy views, to just sort of, she has that kind of free-range political quality. She speaks human and expresses herself with a kind of effortlessly 21st century authenticity that is very noticeably lacking on the front bench of the Conservative Party at the moment. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, you look at one of the things that happened overnight on the election was the sudden aging of the Conservative Party culturally. It suddenly has that air of a slightly haggard, tired, derelict administration that's been around for a bit too long. And one of the reasons there isn't a great move to replace Theresa May is the feeling by a lot of people that if you were to replace her, you would need someone who could represent that kind of cultural, social renewal. And I think Ruth offers them that, and not many other people do.
Well, first of all, I'm not celebrating. I think these are good figures and encouraging. I've not had any celebrations about that. What we have seen is a salivating by the opposition parties trying to talk up a recession before these figures came out. I can tell you that the businesses I talked to in Scotland are sick to the back teeth of the Scottish economy being talked down by the Tories and Labour.
I asked you why you think there's weakness beyond the fall in the oil and gas industry. What's your answer to that before you start telling us how marvellous everything is?
Well, I wasn't quite going to go and say how marvellous everything.
This is my first time. It's off my bucket list. I had two things, one to go abroad and one to come here. I went to abroad last year and I came to Ireland this year.
I'm proud to say that I voted for Jeremy Corbyn. I voted for him in his manifesto because it was a UK election for the UK Parliament.
But in voting for Jeremy Corbyn, are you not undermining the independence cause?
Absolutely not, because there is still a very clear constitutional crisis in the UK that Corbyn doesn't have the answers to. I would like to see the SNP be more radical, of course I would, but I would also like to see, a plurality for independence, where the SNP are not the sole voice for independence.
Kat Boyd said in that film, Gemma Doyle, that she voted for Jeremy Corbyn because there is a perception that a lot of young people, a lot of people who might be considered on the pretty wide left of politics voted, even if they supported independence, actually ended up voting for Jeremy Corbyn. And that there's a way in for Labour there, but it didn't really have very much to do with the Scottish Labour leadership.
I don't think the way back for Labour is anything to do with independence. And actually, I think the Labour Party were successful this year, mainly because they took a very clear line on independence and against any further referendum.
That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that a lot of people who might have voted for independence were attracted by Jeremy Corbyn's version of Labour politics, not necessarily Kezia Dugdale's.
I don't think that's right, actually. I think the vote at the election this year was very much about Kes being very clear about what the Scottish Labour Party were standing for. I mean, Kat Boyd, I think, is in a different party from one week to the next. So for me, she's not the best bellwether of political opinion.
Good evening. Scotland's exam results day has meant a record number of pupils gaining a place at university, including an increase in applicants from some of the country's most deprived communities. The government described it as a steady performance and a base for further progress. Critics, though, said students did well despite SNP policy.
The Education Secretary might want to play the classroom bully, but I promise he can't bully me. So I want to thank individual staff members and trade unions for their support and their tireless campaigning.
The headlines on Reporting Scotland this Wednesday lunchtime. The Prime Minister tells Tory conference the threat of nationalism was set back at the election. Good afternoon. In a speech interrupted by a prankster and then by a prolonged coughing fit, the Prime Minister has praised the performance of the Scottish Conservatives in the recent general election. Battling to make herself heard, Theresa May said the case for a second Scottish referendum had been denied.
States. You mentioned Scotland, and there's some confusion at the moment as to when Scotland might hold a second referendum on Scottish independence. Is there a sense here in Brussels that Scotland is now cherry-picking? That's to say, if the Brexit deal is OK for Scotland, it will say, fine, we'll stay in the UK outside the EU. If it's not OK at that point, we'll try and join the EU. Is that a problem at the moment in terms of Scotland's position here?
Well, the relationship between Scotland and the United Kingdom is a domestic British issue. And in 2014, the EU was completely neutral in the question of Scottish independence or not. And the referendum was agreed between both sides, between Edinburgh and London. The British Constitution sees a possibility of a referendum, and both sides agreed. This is the main difference between the situation in Catalonia and Spain, where the Spanish Constitution doesn't see this possibility, and the Spanish government wouldn't agree to a legally binding referendum. The situation in Scotland is, as I understand it, that the Prime Minister hasn't ruled out the possibility of another referendum in Scotland, but she's been very clear that this certainly will not happen before Brexit has actually taken place. So we will have to just wait and see what this happens, what this means for the United Kingdom.
You don't think then it would be a problem for Scotland to, as it were, rejoin the European Union if that referendum were held only after Brexit actually happens?
Well, the UK joined the European Union, or the European communities, in 1973 as a whole, and the United Kingdom will leave the European Union as a whole, probably on the 29th of March 2019. But to be honest, I deeply regret this decision. I'm a German politician with British roots. I still have close contacts to the United Kingdom. I just feel sorry for the country and for the British people, because in the end, the consequences for leaving the European Union will be negative, because if you leave our family of nations, you can't be in a better position than before. But we have to face reality. I think what is important is that we get this divorce, a divorce we didn't ask for, that we get it done, and we have to get it done in an orderly manner.
What would it take to achieve a breakthrough in the talks, do you think?
Within the responsibility of this Parliament.
Scottish ministers want the UK bill amended. Failing that, they're planning emergency Scots laws to plug any Brexit gap. Along with the Scottish Conservative leader, the Scottish Secretary was at Cabinet in Downing Street today. He says talk of a power grab is nonsense.
It's absolutely the opposite. At the end of this process, the Scottish Parliament will have all the powers and responsibilities that it has today, but it will have additional powers in terms of areas that are currently exercised in Brussels.
In rural Aberdeenshire, they just want answers. They want certainty, if possible.
Well, Brian joins us now from Holyrood. Brian, the UK can go ahead without Holyrood's consent. So why was this announcement today important?
Yeah, they can. They can indeed. I mean, the idea that Holyrood has to give consent was originally laid out in a convention, and the Supreme Court made pretty clear that it is just that, a convention. Westminster can ignore it. They can go ahead with the Brexit process, but you know, they don't want to. Why? Because Brexit itself has been really tough. They want to give the impression, the strong impression of consensus, of the United Kingdom coming together to go through the procedure of Brexit. They don't want a fight with the Scottish Parliament, but you know what? Right now they've got one.
So how do you think this seeming impasse can be resolved?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the Scottish Government stress that they are working with the Welsh Assembly Government, led by Labour. They stress this isn't just an SNP initiative. It's not a Scotland-England thing. They point out that the Assembly in Wales, the Welsh Government, are just as upset, if anything more upset, than the Scottish Government is about what they see as a power grab. So they're going to put forward jointly amendments to the bill at Westminster to try and tailor it in a way that they want. But you heard from David Mundell there. He regards the claims as nonsense, but behind that really a quite strong rhetoric coming from both sides today. You have the offer of talks on both sides. You have the Scottish Government saying they don't want to go their own way. They want to do a deal that works across the whole of the UK. They don't want Brexit at all, but if it has to happen, they want a deal that is collaborative and cooperative. And David Mundell has tonight offered talks to try and bring that about.
Thank you very much. Brian Taylor there at Holyrood. Private schools, universities and leisure centres will have to wait to find out if the Scottish Government is to levy controversial business rates on.
What I think you're saying, Secretary of State, is that's effectively agreement on the procedure. That does not necessarily mean agreement on the content of the frameworks. Or are you saying clearly today that you want agreement on the content of the frameworks and not to be imposed?
No, it was the former. Sorry, I thought I'd made that, because I don't think that we can. I don't think that we, within the timescale, we're not going to be able to agree the content of the frameworks. What I've said in relation to the frameworks is the frameworks are not going to be imposed. We need to find, by the time we get to the legislative consent process, we need to find the basis on which we agree that frameworks will be agreed, the process that you go through to agree a framework.
That brings you right back to Ivan's question in that case. If there is no agreement on the content, how will that be resolved?
That, convener, is a very important part of the process of agreement. It's a very important, and that has to be that has to be resolved.
Just so that I'm clear here. So you expect then there to be a process for agreement of the content to be in place before there's an LCM granted by this Parliament?
I do. But not in relation to the content of what should be happening in relation to the environment. An agreement in relation to how, if there was to be a framework, for example, and it is just an example, in relation to the environment, how that framework would be agreed.
Yesterday, when the Secretary of State for Scotland gave evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee, he was asked whether the government had made its own assessment of the impact of Brexit on Scotland and would he share it with the Scottish Affairs Committee. And he said that there had been such an assessment and it would be shared between governments. So will you now confirm that that assessment of the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy will at least be shared with the Scottish Government?
I think, well, you need to take that up with the Scottish Secretary, but I think that's rather what I said to you about what happened at the last JMC.
Well, no. The question yesterday was from the MP for Edinburgh West.
Not yesterday.
Has the government? Well, just let me put to you what he said. The MP for Edinburgh West asked yesterday, has the government made its own assessment of the impact of Brexit on Scotland, and if so, will you share it with us? And he said that at the JMC meeting, it was agreed that both governments have done a degree of analysis and that it would be shared between the governments. And the MP for Edinburgh West said it would be shared between governments, and he says it would. So can you confirm that the assessment of the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy will be shared with the Scottish Government without further delay?
Well, I'd said to you at the beginning of that question, at the last JMCM, which was before the start of this meeting, the other day, we discussed this very thing and we agreed that there will be official level contact on these issues. Yes.
So the impact, the assessment setting out the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy will be shared with the Scottish Government?
It already, I'm assuming it already has been.
I don't think it has, Secretary of State.
Well, we'll see.
That's why I'm seeking clarification that the Scottish Government will be favoured with a copy of your government's assessment of the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy.
What we have agreed is to go through the individual sectoral effects with them. They've done work of their own as well. It's an exchange. It's going on.
But it's clear from the answer given from
well,
the Secretary...
I'm sure whatever the Secretary of State for Scotland said will be the case, will be true and will happen. I'm sure that's the case, and he may be organising that. But what I'm telling you is what's already happened.
So if the Secretary of State for Scotland has said that information will be shared with the Scottish Government, then we should assume that it will be.
I'm sure it's correct, yes. When a
Thank
minister says something to a committee, that's what I assume happens.
Thank you.
I cannot comment whether Alex Salmond's programme will be editorially independent or not. However,
he says it will be.
As he put it, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
Mr. Rowan Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the House of Commons votes down the new withdrawal bill, will the consequence be that we will still leave on the 29th of March 2019, but without an agreement?
Yes.
What was that?
Yes. The Secretary of State said yes.
So the idea of somebody undermining this revolutionary party is just not on as far as all the rulers are concerned. So ZANU-PF, the ruling party since 1980, 37 years, that's even longer than the Scottish National Party. It's been in there a long time. So they will stay in power.
I mean, I went onto your website before we came on tonight, and they're all stories that I try to undermine our faith
British Medical
in our
Journal
society.
on economic warfare.
They're all trying to divide us. You give prominence to Catalonia, to Scottish independence. You're trying to divide us. I understand why the Kremlin wants to do that. That's perfectly legitimate from its point of view. I'm just puzzled as to why do you want to be part of that?
I think one of the first rules of journalism, the way I see it, and certainly I've practiced it here at the BBC, and at CNN and other outlets, is that the famous phrase, truth to power, we tell our journalists, think of the poorest person watching, see what their lives are like and try and show what life is really like. Not the way, arguably...
What power have you spoken to Mr. Putin?
There have been so many shows about rights in Russia today. What are you talking about? You don't watch the channel. So you haven't seen debates about homosexuality, about Syria, complaints about Russian atrocities in Syria. You haven't watched it. All you three are doing is you're frightened of a new entrant, especially when Sky News may be closing down, your old employer Murdoch may be shutting that down. You may be left all alone here at the BBC. RT may be the main news provider here, who knows?
Well, on that bit of fake news, we'll call an end to it.
You know Murdoch better than I.
So this is a direct challenge to Senior Rajoy. You're challenging him, given that he's called this election. Will he accept the result?
Exactly. Not only for the Mariano Rajoy, also for the European authorities. Because if the majority of Catalan people want to be independent, well, this is a real answer. This is a reality. And we must make politics with the reality, not with a fantasy. Of course, I think the Spanish government and the European authorities would like a Catalonia without people who want independent, but it's real. And if in the next elections we will win, that I propose to the Mr. Rajoy, Mr. Juncker, Mr. Tajani, to accept and to start a new era of dialogue and negotiation about this reality.
Does England lose anything, globally speaking, when it loses Scotland?
In diplomatic and financial terms, you would presume not.
So, would we be better or worse off? We wouldn't have to subsidise them. We wouldn't have to bear the burden of guilt.
Yeah.
They would go off and be more successful.
Well, my perspective is that England probably would be better off independent, partly because we wouldn't have all those collectivist MPs coming down from north of the border to vote on English issues all the time.
So I wasn't surprised by the Brexit vote. I voted Remain, but I really understood that people felt that all these people were telling them what to do, and Brexit for me stems a lot out of what happened in the Scottish indie thing, because when a lot of people in Scotland said, we are going to leave the United Kingdom, the reaction of England was not don't, it was fuck off then. We were not a united kingdom. We are not a united kingdom. And somehow I think Brexit has really exposed that.
In fact, people want to buy UK goods and services because they regard having a Union Jack on it as a sign of quality. That's not something that we would want to diminish, nor do I think our consumers would allow us to do so.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has mentioned the devolved administrations on a number of occasions. I'm advised by Scottish Government colleagues that the documents they've received contain nothing substantial at all about Scotland. On the 24th and 25th of October, the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union gave evidence respectively to the Scottish Affairs Committee and the Exiting the EU Select Committee that assessments of the impact of Brexit on the Scottish economy existed and would be shared with the Scottish Government. Will he confirm that those unedited documents will now be shared without further delay?
I can confirm to the Honourable and Learned Lady that the documents that are being shared with the Select Committee are also being shared in the usual way with permanent secretaries of the devolved administrations on the same basis they've been shared with the Select Committee. And those sectoral analyses do, in many cases, contain important analysis of Scottish issues.
But I have to say, some of the comments I've heard from this side of the chamber have been unmitigated piles of mince.
It's thought the UK and EU have made clear progress in the Brexit talks ahead of a key meeting in Brussels. Theresa May will speak to the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker later, with the Irish border appearing to be the main outstanding issue. It comes as MPs continue to scrutinise the impact of the EU withdrawal bill, transposing European law to the UK, and the subsequent implications for devolution. The SNP says Westminster is attempting a power grab. The Scottish Conservative MP John Lamont says that's not true.
The Scottish Government is involved in a game of playing grievance politics with every single opportunity that arises. This is just the latest chapter in their book of grievance. They're always going to find fault with the UK Government. They want to leave the United Kingdom. One thing I'm very, very clear about is throughout the challenges of Brexit, Scotland's place is best off within a strong United Kingdom and not trying to go down the path which the SNP are trying to pursue.
The United Union has called on the Scottish Government to force RBS to reverse its plans to close more than a third of its branches.
Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the cooperation between the two, and Northern Ireland's desire to come out of the EU on the same terms as the rest of the UK. So I think perhaps Nicola Sturgeon might have jumped the gun there.
OK, Georgie, thank you very much indeed. That's our political report.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend share my sense of gratitude to our friends in the Democratic Unionist Party who have helped Her Majesty's government stick to its own policy in these negotiations? And is it not essential that the red lines on maintaining the United Kingdom and on regulatory divergence whence the benefits of leaving come are indelible red lines?
Secretary of State.
The red line for me is delivering the best Brexit for Britain, and that's what we'll do.
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State tell us the difference between regulatory convergence and regulatory alignment?
One's about harmonisation, one's not.
The Secretary of State said one's about harmonisation and the other's not. Somebody was suggesting he or she couldn't hear.
There's no sort of systematic impact assessment.
So the answer to the question is no.
Yeah.
So the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments on the implications for leaving the EU for different sectors of the British economy. So there isn't one, for example, on the automotive sector.
On the
automotive sector?
No, not I'm aware of. No.
Is there one on aerospace?
Not I'm aware of.
No. One on financial services?
Well, I think the answer is going to be no to all of them.
No to all of them, right. Now, doesn't it strike you, Secretary of State, as rather strange, given experience around the committee in which you have, the government undertakes impact assessments on all sorts of things all of the time, that on the most fundamental change that we are facing as a country, you've just told us that the government hasn't undertaken any impact assessments at all, looking at the impact on individual sectors of the economy.
Good evening. The Scottish Conservative leader, Ruth Davidson, has accused the First Minister of trying to weaponise Brexit to push for independence.
God bless you, God bless Israel, God bless the Palestinians, and God bless
the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do you think that this week's kerfuffle has been necessary? I mean, do you feel slightly guilty that perhaps the Irish government overbriefed what they'd been achieved as a victory over the British for the European Union? That provoked the DUP. And if you'd been a bit more straightforward about a practical agreement at the beginning, we wouldn't have had these 4 days of turmoil.
Well, clearly that's a briefing you've been getting from the British side. I mean, we never looked for or claimed any victory over anybody. We have been saying for many months now that we want to work with the British government to try and find a way forward that can reassure people in Ireland as well as within the UK that we can manage Brexit and we can limit damage in the way that is now in this agreement. That's always been our position. Yes, of course, there's been some friction because many people have been saying, look, we don't need and don't want to give those assurances right now. We'll deal with these issues in phase 2. The Irish government's response to that has always been, look, that for us is like a jump into the dark. We don't know where we're going to land. We don't know whether we're going to have unintended consequences. And we need basic reassurance that actually certain things will not happen under any circumstances when we move on to phase 2. And one of those issues is the assurance that there will not be a hard border on the island. Another is that we will protect the Good Friday Agreement. Another today is that we will protect peace funding. Another is that we will protect what's called the common travel area between Ireland and Britain so that people can move between both countries and live and work and study and access social welfare entitlements and healthcare and so on. All of those things are really important. They're part of normal life and the relationship between our two islands, which is a complex one, but a deeply interwoven one, if you like, between Irish and British people. And we wanted some guarantees and assurances in phase 1 before we moved on to phase 2 so that we could settle some of the concerns that people had. And I think we've achieved that by working with the British negotiating team and others to make that happen.
As I understand your evidence, the humble address asked for impact assessments arising from those analyses. Impact assessments is a technical term, and in accordance with that technical term, no such impact assessments exist. Is that my correct understanding?
That's basically correct, yes.
And therefore it follows that actually the government has gone beyond the requirements of the humble address. The government could simply have said, this does not exist, we're not giving you anything because we cannot provide the committee with something that does not exist. Is that also correct?
Technically that's correct, yes. No.
And so in fact you have responded rather than meanly and in a redacted sense, generously and fully to the requirements of the humble address by providing 800 pages of information that is not in fact an impact assessment because those do not exist, but is pulling together as far as possible the sectoral assessments that had already been done.
It is getting as close as we can to meeting what we took to be the intent of Parliament. In achieving that, Mr. Rees-Mogg, I also read, because as you know I couldn't make the debate myself, I also read the speech particularly of Sir Keir Starmer. And in it he said, they accepted gisting and redaction and so on. What we've tried to do is be as full as possible within that context. I mean, you may, given that you all know Whitehall, you will probably be able to work out that the pressure from Whitehall was to give summaries, gists, and so on. I resisted that. We could have sent 2-page summaries on all these sectors. We didn't.
So, in a sense, you have looked at the wording of what turns out to be an incompetent motion, and then at the debate that surrounded it, and tried to fulfil the requirements of the House of Commons in spirit, even though in fact you could have rejected it altogether.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
It's a sort of statement of the obvious that any new government is elected on a mandate of its own. Now, we would be re-elected, I would hope, on the mandate that the deal we've delivered. Any other government might not be, and that's a function of democracy, of course.
Secretary, I can see why James Kelly was reshuffled after 24 hours in the post as finance spokesperson. Kezia Dugdale might be back from the jungle, but James Kelly's auditioning for Pointless, I understand. In terms of See what I mean, presiding officer?
But it seems that Scotland has been particularly affected, and really we need to find out why that's the case, why its economic growth has been, at the bottom end of the set of countries who have been exposed to globalization, to, huge changes in technology and so on over the last decade. Why has Scotland done, isn't at the bottom end of economic performance among small developed countries?
David Bell, thanks very much.
America will put our embassy in Jerusalem. That is what the American people want us to do, and it is the right thing to do. No vote in the United Nations will make any difference on that. But this vote will make a difference on how Americans look at the UN and on how we look at countries who disrespect us in the UN. And this vote will be remembered. Thank you.
There's also the factor of, and I have to say it, until recently at least, the historical illiteracy of this country. I was speaking this afternoon to the fifth and sixth years of Holyrood High School in Edinburgh in a question and answer situation. And I had to admit to them that I didn't do history at school because it was boring and so badly taught in the 1960s. As late as 1964, the Burnett Fletcher Chair elect of History at the University of Aberdeen, Professor John Hargreaves, stated in his inaugural lecture, the history of Scotland since 1707 is less studied than the history of Yorkshire. That has completely changed during the generation that I've been honoured to be a part of. But nevertheless, the teaching of Scottish history in schools has been, until the last 15 to 20 years, lamentable. So it's not a surprise that everybody's forgotten about that European connection that was so important in moulding this nation in previous generations.
All right, thank you. We'll stay in the United Kingdom. Why did the Brits vote for Brexit?
Because they're morons.
Next question.
So all right, this is where it becomes comedy, but it's also tragedy, and the best comedy is tragedy, right? So here's the way it worked before. The Brits had the thing called the pound, right? It's cute. I had a picture of Elizabeth on it, right? Now, they were never going to join the euro. And because they were never going to join the euro, they didn't have to put up with any of the nonsense of the Germans and their perpetual belt tightening, right? Any of that crap. They didn't have to put up with all these rules called the fiscal compact and the deficit reduction procedure. They were never going to join. And the best thing about being a country is having your own money. Because if your banking system goes, poof, you can print money to save it if you want. You can also decide not to. You can take a hit through the exchange rate because you have one. So you basically default slowly on foreigners in your cash rather than on your own people. If you don't have your own currency, if you give that up, you can't do any of these tricks. And what that means is either you let everything default, you blow up the banking system, which would be for the whole of Europe, which would be crazy, or alternatively, you squeeze internal devaluation. Welcome to Greece, right? Why is Greece in such a... That's why they don't have their own money. Now, the Brits are smart enough to go, we're never giving this up. We're one of the big three. We get to tell the Germans and the French, no, we're not doing that, no, we're not doing that. We get to veto anything we don't like. We have our own massive financial sector, which is really big and earns us tons of money. We get to clear all these euro transactions. We have this lovely little hedge currency between the euro and the dollar called the pound. It's deep and it's liquid. Our property markets are the biggest money laundering scheme on the planet, right? We have the best deal ever. David Cameron renegotiated the best deal ever and then decided he didn't like it, took it to the British people and said, what do you think of the EU? And they basically said, we don't know, but we hate you. Because it wasn't really about the EU. It was about to the elites, basically. And then the result came in and they went, oh, crap. So they handed it to May, and now May has to negotiate the best deal ever, having defaulted on the best deal ever twice. So in my book, they're morons. Now, is that fair? Yeah, if you're going to decide on someone as complex and important as the EU, have a debate about the EU. Don't make up stuff about 350 million a week for the healthcare system if we don't pay taxes to Brussels. You might as well turn around and say, well, Mark Blythe would be 7 foot tall if he didn't eat carrots. right? There's just as much factual content in that one. But we've got this world now where you have to give both sides of the debate an answer. All right, over here we have someone with facts and knowledge and data, and over here we have a complete lunatic. Let's give them equal time. That was basically the Brexit vote.